Hi, I'm George Pino with Commercial Brokers International, and wait for this, I got a special surprise for all of you. Free legal advice. Now take heed, you get what you pay for, but I have a great person here who's going to help us out a little bit. Scott Mayer, you may recognize from a couple of the other videos that we've done together. We're doing a little legal series on commercial real estate and real estate in general for our viewerships. So when I say free legal advice, I'm not asking you to give away all your trades and secrets and all that, but you know, one of the reasons one of the things I always hear from clients, or from my agents also hear from clients, is why do I need to have an attorney involved regarding this lease negotiation? And you know, generally speaking, we as brokers negotiate the financial terms, the economic terms.
Correct.
But they're a lease itself, and as in my training classes with younger agents, I always tell them a lease, a commercial lease, can be a lot more difficult to do than a sale. I mean, a sale is pretty straightforward, but a commercial lease, you're taking into account what may happen 5, 10, 15, 20 years, or potentially 40 or 50 years down the road.
Yes.
So you have to build all of that in. And I think the easiest explanation, from the way to explain it to someone who's a little bit more of a novice, is that purchase and sale agreements typically about 8, 9, 10 pages. Commercial lease, the shortest one I think I've seen with the amendments is about 40. Mm-hmm. And some are 60, 80, 100. I've seen over 100 pages in length. So, you know, with that in mind, there are certain clauses I know that we should look at. You know, one of the things that's the easy one to pick out is something called a holdover clause, where people don't, you know, a lot of tenants, especially if they're new, and even some relatively astute, they're not really aware of what a holdover clause is, which is essentially that if you hold over after the lease ends, your rent can go up automatically by a certain amount. Now, the amounts can be negotiated and or the clause itself, but what are some other clauses that you see in a commercial lease that are often negotiated or should be looked at to help protect the tenant or landlord a little bit better?
So, George, thank you for that introduction. I've personally negotiated over 200 commercial leases over my career, and I would say every clause in a commercial lease has either financial liability or liability itself attached to it. And so every clause needs to be looked at and negotiated. But for example, the holdover clause you mentioned, generally a landlord will say, if you hold over 1 day after the term expires, we want you to pay 150% of the rent you were just paying.
Mm-hmm.
But that can be negotiated. And you can start by saying, well, if I hold over for 30 days, I'll pay you 110%. Mm-hmm. If I hold over for 60, another 30 days, I'll pay you 125%. Just an example.
Well, there may be a holdover. You may be holding over because you're in good faith negotiating a new renewal.
Correct.
And that holdover clause shouldn't take into account, shouldn't be in effect, and most landlords would waive that in that circumstance. But they may still be liable if it's not negotiated ahead of time.
So, again, going back to the holdover clause, you want to put in there, if landlord and tenant are negotiating for additional term, it's not a holdover situation. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't have to pay additional rent. Yeah. For example, operating expenses. Mm-hmm. So in a commercial property, one pays rent. It depends, office versus retail. So let's take a retail lease. One pays a base rent, and then one reimburses the landlord for the expenses of operating and managing the property. Mm-hmm. A landlord is going to give you an operating expense reimbursement clause that has every sort of expense that he or she can think of in the clause, and ask you to pay your proportionate share of that. Mm-hmm. So, for example, a landlord's clause might say, tenant, you are responsible for your proportionate share of any sort of capital improvements we make to the property. So if we replace the roof, if we replace the HVAC system, you're going to pay your proportionate share. Now, that's not common because a smart attorney representing the tenant, the retail tenant, will say, wait a minute, capital expenditures should not be passed along. But then there are gray areas where if the landlord says it's a deal breaker, then you can come back and say, well, I should only pay not in the year that the capital expenditure occurred, but that capital expenditure should be amortized over its useful life.
Over the useful life, absolutely. And then that way they're not paying for a term that they're not going to use.
Correct. That's an example. It could be use. So I come in and I have a restaurant, and the landlord comes back to me and says, okay, the only legal use you can have under this lease is as a sit-down restaurant. Now, without an attorney, the restaurant tenant will probably say, that's fine, because that's my use.
That's what I do.
But what happens if they get into financial difficulty and they want to
sublease it to someone else,
sublease or sign the lease? But the lease now says it can only be used for a sit-down restaurant. So even something as seemingly harmless as the use provision should be expanded to, you would want it to say that all legally permissible uses are allowed, not just a sit-down restaurant.
Yes. And you know, I know with real estate attorneys and legal, like for instance, one of the things that we always try and look at is what can be carved out of the expense reimbursements as well, going back to that. You know, in California, a lot of times a landlord may have, or a new landlord may want to put earthquake insurance on, which can be cost prohibitive.
Yes.
And that may be a issue that could really increase the reimbursement, both on, you know, and from what I understand how, and you know, office leases work, you typically have a base year, and you're still responsible for all the increases above that base year.
Yes.
So, you know, carving out certain things, whether, you know, it's tenant improvements if they're doing, you know, you shouldn't, any cost to lease should be carved out probably, and things, but I think it's really important to have an attorney that can actually point out some of those things to carve out, because it makes sense logically to do so.
Yes. So you were talking about an office lease, and generally you pay a rent, and then you've got a base year, which is usually where the operating expenses are determined, and that's generally the first year of the lease, the first year after the commencement date, although that can change. But suppose your building is half empty. You get a great deal in an office building, but it's half empty. And in your base year, the expenses are low because only half the building is occupied. But let's say in a year following, the landlord has now leased the building 100%. Well, the expenses of operating the building have gone up because now you have 100%. So your expense reimbursement is going to be much higher. So you would want to negotiate in the for the base year that it should be taken as if the building was 100% leased. I mean, there are little tricks of the trade like that, but these are things that can save you, a commercial tenant, a substantial amount of money, and also
especially over the life of the lease.
Yes.
You know, a lot of times they just look at it, well, is it really worth it? It's only $1,000. Well, that's $1,000 a month. So, yes, is the answer. It is worth it. And, you know, one of the other things as well when it comes to the clauses in commercial leases, you know, you have to almost kind of go in thinking of every aspect of your business and how it operates, and explain that, you know, communication, like everything in life, is key, especially when it comes to something along these lines. For instance, I had a client who used therapy animals in her business practice. Now, most people immediately think therapy animals, okay, ADA compliant, but commercial doesn't necessarily fall under that use for therapy animals. Therapy animals don't fall under the ADA compliance, and so we actually had to carve out and build that into the lease that they had the rights to do so. You know, so it sounds to me that what you're kind of saying is that, you know, since every paragraph or clause in a lease may have some sort of liability, everything should be looked at At the same time, I think in practicality, you're never going to get, there's an old saying out there that the best negotiation is when both parties are unhappy. Okay?
Correct.
Because they both didn't get everything they wanted.
Correct.
And realistically speaking, and this is really understanding and relying on your broker to also convey to you what the current market conditions are. Because as good as an attorney is, their job is to mitigate risk for you, their client, and protect you as much as possible. That may or may not be feasible given current market conditions, meaning if it's a super hot market and you have a property that is everybody is in demand, there's multiple offers, and there may be concessions that you have to give.
Yes.
And you have to understand that and realize that. So rely on your broker for that, but also don't forget about the real estate attorney to help them with some of the clauses when it comes to getting out. And I think what's overlooked a lot is kind of going along the lines of what you're talking about with the sublease and the use language, but also, the rights to assign or the rights to sublease, what triggers it, where it is, the option language, whether it's conditioned upon the actual person that signed the original lease. So from what I've gathered from what you're saying, all the clauses in a lease typically have some form of liability attached to it, whether it's financial or other,
Yes.
and should be reviewed by your attorney to help mitigate the risk. And an attorney is there to help mitigate the risk, but I want to throw this out there as well because I wouldn't be doing my job as a broker. You should also rely on the advice of your broker who can give you advice of what's currently happening in the marketplace to determine whether or not the negotiation is feasible or not. Meaning, if you're in a really hot market and there's multiple offers, multiple tenants going after a specific space, you may not be able to take a hard line stance. So you want to make sure that you have certain things that you can give up, understanding what it may be for liability or monetary liability that it may incur. One thing though that I always tell my clients to really try and push back on and try and fight on is the assignment and sublease clauses.
Yes.
Making sure that it's not personal to them, being able to structure it, because the last thing a business operator wants to think about is closing their business down.
Correct.
So because of that, human nature, a lot of them put their head in the sand. They don't necessarily look at the assignment clauses and the sublease clauses. And, I think that's really important for an attorney to really come in there and protect them on that so it's as open as possible so that ultimately, if something does go bad, you have different options and opportunities that you can do.
Yeah. The novice who gets a lease doesn't know all the possibilities that may occur in the future. They're just thinking of today, wow, I got this great lease. But 5 years, 7 years later, they may need to get out of their business. And so they would want the rights, the free rights to sublease or assign a lease. But oftentimes, a lease that a commercial landlord will give you will say, you cannot assign or sublease without my consent.
Mm-hmm.
And it may not even be reasonable consent. It may just be consent with no qualifiers. So a good, smart attorney will come in and say, wait a minute, we need to allow the tenant to have freer assignment and subletting rights because so we want to put a reasonable consent clause in. Mm-hmm. We want to say if these matters are satisfied by the potential subtenant or assignee, then the landlord has to consent. Mm-hmm. So there are all kinds of pitfalls, and these pitfalls don't have to occur if you hire an experienced, knowledgeable real estate attorney.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and also it's just, I think if anything, having a real estate attorney at the very least gives you a better understanding of what you're committing to. Because a lot of times, when you get 20, 30, 40, 50, or 100 pages put in front of you, I can tell you, generally speaking, they haven't read but maybe a couple of them.
Correct.
And so you really want to have that, and really the key points that are, one, potential deal killers. They need to be aware of that these are hardline stances that we need to take, and here's why. But also, where we can negotiate, and also what we can expect. And that's where the experience comes in. And, you know, you mentioned earlier, you know, 200 leases, pretty darn good. Pretty good amount to take a look at. It's funny, the last comment I'll make is, you know, I hear this a lot from clients. Why do I need an attorney or a broker to help negotiate my lease renewal or lease? I've done one for my business for the last 10 years. Well, that means they've done 2. So maybe 2.
Yeah.
Rely on expertise. You know, whether it's your broker who understands the market conditions and can get you the best deal that's out there on the economic side, or whether it's an attorney who knows what's currently going on and what laws have changed in the last 10 years,
Yes.
and can then protect you and your business that you have built over that time by doing so. So for more information, please feel free to reach out. I'm going to have Scott's information down below here for you. And as always, please feel free to reach out here. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe.